In the spring of 2009, a man named Dale Voss stood inside a falling-down dairy barn on 62 acres of hill country in Wythe County, Virginia, while an appraiser from the county extension office walked the perimeter with a clipboard and shook his head. The barn had been built in 1887 by Dale's great-grandfather, a Norwegian immigrant named Ivar who had hauled white oak up a ridge by mule team and fitted the timbers by hand without a nail longer than 3 inches in the load-bearing joints. By 2009, the siding had gone gray as pewter. The lower courses of chestnut had rotted out at the sill, and the whole structure listed 4 degrees east, like it was trying to get a better look at the valley. The appraiser's name was Roland Fitch. He had a degree in agricultural appraisal from Virginia Tech and 20 years of rural property assessments behind him, and he had the calm, measured manner of a man who has delivered the same verdict on many old structures and lost no sleep over any of them. He wrote the barn's contributory value to the property at 0. Tear-down liability, he called it, and he said it in the way a man says something he believes he is doing you a favor by telling you plainly. He set his clipboard on the hood of his county truck and told Dale he could connect him with a demolition contractor who sometimes offered a small salvage credit on structural timber when the market was active. In this case, Roland said, he did not think the market was active. It would mostly cost Dale to have it pulled, and the sooner the better, because a structure leaning at that angle was a documented liability on the property record. Dale Voss looked at the barn the way he always looked at everything, for a long time without speaking. He thanked Roland for coming out. He walked back to the house and set the kettle on. 14 years later, a furniture buyer named Marcus Webb drove a rented box truck from Manhattan to Wythe County overnight, arriving in the pre-dawn dark with a cup of coffee going cold in the cup holder and a cashier's check in his shirt pocket for $41,000. He had driven 7 hours for what Roland Fitch had assessed as a liability. He had not negotiated the price. He sat in the truck for several minutes after he pulled off the road, looking at the stacked timber in the gray light before the sun came over the ridge, and when the amber finally broke across the old wood and showed the color and the grain of it, the chestnut going warm and dark like old honey in the low morning light, he said only that he wished he had come sooner. That is where this story ends. Let me tell you where it begins. Dale Voss was 53 years old in 2009, and he had been farming those 62 acres since he was 26, when his mother signed the deed over to him rather than watch the county take the property for back taxes. He was known in Wythe County for 2 things: for being the quietest man at any meeting he ever attended, and for never discarding wood. Every outbuilding he had ever torn down, every fence post he had ever pulled, every timber he had salvaged from a neighbor's demolition, a condemned structure, or a county highway right-of-way, he had stacked under cover on the back acre of his property. He sorted each load by species and dimension before it went under the roof, and he covered the rows with corrugated tin, held down by flat fieldstones, and he labeled each row with a painted card tacked to a stake in the ground: white oak, chestnut, poplar, black walnut, red oak, yellow pine. By 2009, that covered woodyard held just over 80,000 board feet of salvaged timber going back 30 years. Some of the chestnut had come from a barn pulled down in 1981, the last standing structure on a neighboring farm that had been in the same family since before the Civil War. A boy from that farm had run across the fence line to tell Dale the demolition crew was arriving, and Dale had been there before noon with a borrowed flatbed, loading boards while the crew was still pulling nails from the siding. Some of the walnut had come from a farmhouse demolished for a highway bypass in 1994. Dale had filled a borrowed trailer twice that day. First load before the crew finished lunch, second load before they packed up for the evening. Roland Fitch did not assess the wood yard. It was not a structure, and it was not tillable acreage, and it did not appear on his form. To the county tax office, it was a storage area with maintenance concerns. To Dale, it was the whole point. Let me tell you about old-growth timber, because what follows will not make sense without it. The wood Dale had been collecting was not the kind of wood you find at a lumber yard, and the difference between them is not a matter of degree. It is a matter of kind. The trees that produced the beams in Ivor's 1887 barn had grown in uncut Appalachian forest for 200 years before the first axe touched them. They grew slowly, competing for light under a closed canopy, adding less than a quarter inch of radius in a good year. Growth rings that form at that pace, packed that tightly together, produce a cellular structure that is fundamentally different from the fast-growth pine and Douglas fir the commercial lumber industry has been raising since the 1950s, when the old-growth supply ran out and the industry moved to plantation timber on a 30-year rotation. Old-growth timber is predominantly late wood. Late wood is the dense, dark wood a tree lays down in late summer when its growth slows to almost nothing. Early wood is the pale, loose-grained wood that rushes in during the spring flush. A board cut from a slow-grown tree is mostly late wood, dense and interlocked across the grain, the fibers running together in ways that resist splitting. A board cut from a 30-year plantation pine is mostly early wood, light and fibrous, prone to checking along the grain when the humidity shifts. The density difference between old-growth white oak and plantation pine is the difference between 48 pounds per cubic foot, dry, and 25. That gap translates directly to hardness, to dimensional stability over decades, and to a natural resistance to insects and decay that fast-grown wood simply does not carry in its cells. Old-growth American chestnut is a separate matter entirely. The chestnut blight, introduced through Asian nursery stock around 1904, swept through the eastern hardwood forest and killed every mature American chestnut east of the Mississippi over the following 4 decades, taking each tree from crown to root collar. The root system survived and still send up sprouts in Wythe County and throughout the Appalachian Range, but the blight kills those sprouts before they reach timber size every time. The chestnut timber that exists in old barns and fence lines and granaries is all that remains of a tree species that once made up a full quarter of the eastern hardwood canopy. There will be no more of it. What exists now is the complete inventory. Dale had 12,000 board feet of it, in the second row from the east wall of the wood yard, and he also had 6 original chestnut fence posts pulled from a property line when a neighbor sold the farm and the new owner replaced the old fence with woven wire. The posts had been in Wythe County ground for 80 years when Dale pulled them, and he covered them with the best tin he had. A man who burns a chestnut fence post does not know what he has. Dale knew. The furniture and architecture world, or at least a particular and growing corner of it, had been arriving at an understanding of what this material was worth. The understanding had not yet reached Wythe County in 2009. Roland Fitch had not encountered it in his continuing education hours. The county tax form did not have a column for it. Dale did not have the language to explain it to anyone who was not already looking for it. He just kept stacking. His neighbor to the north was a man named Gary Prater, 3 years younger than Dale, who farmed 120 acres with ambitions that matched the scale of the land. Gary had borrowed against the property in 2004 to buy a new skid steer and a finish mower, then borrowed again in 2006 for a small portable sawmill, calculating that he could cut green lumber from the timber lots on his back acreage and sell it to a framing contractor who was building subdivisions in Bland County at a pace that seemed like it would not stop. For a while, the calculation was correct. Green pine at $200 per 1,000 board feet, with steady orders from the contractor running through 2007. Then the housing market collapsed in 2008. The contractor stopped returning calls, and Gary found himself holding a sawmill he owed $40,000 on, and a timber lot he had cut too hard and too fast to support another production run for at least 15 years. He kept the sawmill turning on reduced volume, selling to whoever would buy, but the equipment note was $480 a month, and on the reduced volume, that note was consuming his margin entirely, leaving nothing forward and nothing behind. Dale had been offered the framing contractor's business himself in the spring of 2005, approached in a casual conversation at the county sale barn. He had said he did not have the timber for it. Gary had assumed he meant he did not have enough volume. What Dale meant was something else, something he had never put into words because the conversation had not required it. Roland Fitch returned to the Voss property in the fall of 2011, called by the bank holding the note on the original purchase mortgage, a note that Dale's mother had refinanced twice in the years before she transferred the deed. The bank wanted to reassess the collateral. Roland walked the fields and the outbuildings, noted the wood yard in his report as a maintenance area that would need to be resolved before the property could be marketed to a buyer, and recommended a short extension on the note at the bank's discretion. Dale thanked him without argument and went home and stacked 2 more loads of poplar he had pulled from a demolished granary 12 miles east, on a farm being subdivided by an estate. A woodworker from Roanoke named Cal Reese had pulled his truck over at the wood yard in the summer of 2007, slowing when he saw the labeled rows of covered timber from the road, because a man who works with wood recognizes what it is from a distance, the way a farmer recognizes a well-tended field. Cal built custom furniture in a garage shop, small pieces for clients who paid attention to the material, and he bought 300 board feet of chestnut and some walnut slabs on his first visit. He came back twice more that year. He paid Dale $150 per 100 board feet for the chestnut, 10 times what green commercial pine was bringing, and Dale had not known what to say, so he said nothing and took the money. Before the third visit ended, Cal told Dale that the chestnut was going to sell as finished furniture at $1,500 per 100 board feet. He said it plainly, in the way men tell each other useful facts without ornamentation. He thought Dale deserved to know what he had. Dale thanked him and went back to stacking. Petra Voss came back to Wythe County in January of 2010 after 4 years of business administration at Radford University and a year at a commercial real estate firm in Roanoke. She was 26 years old, and she had the questions that a formal business education teaches you to ask when you look at an operation's income against its outgo. She sat at the kitchen table and went through the property's finances, line by line, and said, carefully and without any wish to wound, that the barn was a liability. She had read Roland Fitch's assessment, and it aligned with everything her training had prepared her to identify. She was not wrong about what her training could see. Dale looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. He asked what would happen if they tried to sell the wood. Petra said she did not know who would buy it. Dale said he had a name. He called Cal Reese the next morning. Cal listened and said he knew a man in Charlottesville named Herb Dorsey who ran a reclaimed wood operation, buying salvaged timber from demolitions and reselling it to furniture studios, woodworkers, and architects, specifying reclaimed material for restaurants and hotels that were beginning to pay for character in their interiors the way wineries paid for terroir. He could make no promises, Cal said. That was fine, Dale said. Herb Dorsey drove down from Charlottesville in March of 2010 and walked the woodyard for 2 hours with his hands clasped behind his back, moving slowly between the rows, stopping at each species marker. He stopped longest at the chestnut. He picked up one board, turned it in both hands, pressed his thumb pad firmly to the end grain, and counted rings with his eyes. He did not speak for the better part of a minute. Then he asked how long Dale had been collecting. Dale said 30 years. Herb nodded and kept walking without another word until he had seen every row. He made an offer on 12,000 board feet at prices that made Petra revise her arithmetic 3 times, certain she had misplaced a decimal somewhere. The chestnut he valued at $3 per board foot. On the raw salvage market, $600 per 100 board feet, compared to the $150 that Cal had been paying, and the $20-odd per 100 board feet that green commercial pine was bringing at the time. He explained that the market for authenticated old-growth salvage had moved in the past 5 years, that restaurants and hotels and a growing number of private clients had discovered that reclaimed timber with document provenance could not be replaced once gone, and were now paying prices for it that would have sounded improbable at the turn of the century. The barn beams, he said, if Dale was willing to sell them, would go higher still because of the hand-hewn surfaces. He used the word provenance, meaning the documented origin and age and history of the material. Dale said the barn beams were not for sale yet. Herb said he understood that entirely. He bought the 12,000 board feet over 4 months, arranged all of the hauling, and left Dale with a check that cleared the mortgage extension, paid 2 years of delinquent property taxes, and left a balance in the account that had not been there in a long time. Petra looked at the balance for a while. Then she sat down. Roland Fitch drove past the property in April of 2010, on his way to an assessment in the eastern part of the county. The woodyard had a gap in it, where 12,000 board feet had shipped. He did not stop. If you have ever held something for 30 years because you believed in it, and had a person you trusted tell you it was worth nothing, you know exactly what Petra's face looked like when she finally added those numbers correctly. If you have ever had to defend something you could see clearly that everyone else walked past, leave a comment below. Stay close, because the barn itself is still to come. The drought came in the summer of 2012 the way structural failures always come. Quietly first, then suddenly and without apology. April was dry enough that the farmers in the county took notice, the pastures turning brown a month earlier than usual. May was drier, the soil cracking at the field margins before the end of the month. June broke every heat record in Wythe County since 1936, 7 consecutive days above 96 degrees in the first half of the month, and no meaningful rainfall from the 15th of May to the 4th of July. By that first week of July, the corn in the valley was burning from the top down. The leaves curled inward on themselves before the tassels had finished forming. The silks dried before pollination was complete. In Gary Prater's fields, compacted from years of heavy equipment traffic and bare between the rows because Gary had not run a cover crop since he bought the sawmill and shifted his attention to the timber operation, the rare rainfall sheeted off the hardened ground and left nothing behind. His corn that summer yielded 41 bushels per acre. The county average was 47. The state average in the regions that had not been hit as severely ran 112 bushels. Dale's bottomland was different. in a way that had taken 15 years to build and was invisible to anyone who had not watched it being built. He had been running a cover crop program since the mid-90s, seeding the fields every fall after harvest with a mix of hairy vetch, winter rye, and crimson clover, keeping the soil biologically active through the cold months, building the organic matter slowly the way his father and his father's father had understood it needed to be built, without drama and without shortcuts, adding a fraction of a percent per year through root biomass and decomposition, and the microbial activity that follows from having living roots in the ground most of the year. By 2012, his topsoil had a structure that could absorb water quickly, hold it through a dry week, and make it available to roots that had channels to follow down into the subsoil. His corn in 2012 yielded 108 bushels per acre from 40 acres of bottomland, in the same drought, in the same county, on the same schedule of no rain. The difference between those two numbers was arithmetic, and it had a specific explanation. The County Extension Office had tested Dale's topsoil in 2011 at Petra's request, as part of a documentation project she was building to support the wood business. Organic matter on Dale's bottom land came in at 4.2%. On Gary Prater's comparable acres across the fence line, tested in the same round, it came back at 1.1%. Soil at 4% organic matter retains roughly 40% more water per unit volume than soil at 1%. In a normal year, that difference is invisible in the field. In the summer of 2012, it was visible from the road. One cornfield burning brown from the top, one field holding green into August. And it was visible again in October on two different elevator receipts written in the same county for the same crop in the same drought year. Gary came to the kitchen table in September of 2012 after the harvest was in and the damage was calculated. He was not angry. He was tired in the particular way a man gets tired when he has trusted the credentialed recommendation and followed it faithfully for close to a decade, and then an event comes along that the recommendation had not prepared him for, and the failure is not his in the sense of negligence, but the cost of it falls on him completely. He asked Dale about the cover crops, the specific mix, the seeding rates, the timing of spring termination, what the winter rye did to the soil structure, and why the vetch mattered. Dale told him all of it in more words than he usually used in a month, because Gary was ready to hear it, and that changed everything about what Dale was willing to say. Gary went home and ordered seed that week and put it in the ground before the frost. The barn question returned in the autumn of 2013. Herb Dorsey called to say that the furniture studio in Charlottesville had a client inquiry asking specifically for documented hand-hewn barn beam material, old-growth white oak and chestnut with the hewn faces preserved, with provenance documentation attached to every piece, so the complete history of the material could be transmitted to the end buyer. The studio was prepared to pay premium prices for material that could be fully documented, from tree to beam to barn to finished piece. Herb gave Dale a price range of $12 to $18 per board foot for primary structural timber, weighted by species and quality. His estimate from the photographs Dale had sent placed the barn's primary beam volume at between 2,800 and 3,200 board feet. Petra sat at the kitchen table and did the arithmetic twice, then a third time. She said the number was between $34,000 and $58,000. She said it quietly, the way a person says a number that has required 3 calculations to believe. Dale said he needed to think about it. He thought through most of the winter of 2013 and into the early spring of 2014. He sat with it the way he sat with any large question, returning to it in the evenings, not forcing it toward a conclusion before he understood it completely. He talked to Petra many times. He talked to Cal Reese, who had expanded his shop by then and was buying regularly from Herb's inventory, and had a view of the furniture market that Dale trusted. Cal said what Dale had been circling for months, and said it plainly and without sentiment. The barn will come down eventually, one way or another, because that is what every barn does when no one has the resources to maintain it indefinitely. The question is not whether the wood goes. The question is where it goes and whether the story goes with it. Cal said there were clients of his who built pieces that carried their origin openly, that could be documented to a named farm and a named year and a named builder's hands. He said the adze marks on the beams from Ivor's barn were not marks of rough workmanship. They were evidence of a specific hand at a specific time, and evidence of that kind cannot be manufactured at any price. Dale called Herb in April of 2014 with conditions. He wanted the deconstruction done by hand, not by machine, so the mortise pockets and the hewn surfaces were preserved intact. He wanted the timbers kept full length, not cut short for the convenience of hauling. He wanted a provenance letter on the studio's letterhead for every client who bought a piece made from the Voss barn, naming the structure, the year of construction, the builder's name, and the year of deconstruction. Those were his terms. The studio agreed to all of them without negotiation. They sent a 4-man deconstruction crew in June of 2014, men who worked with pry bars and timber tongs and a patience matched to the age of what they were taking apart. The crew foreman was a man named Pete Hayward, who had been doing this specific work for 11 years across Virginia and Maryland and West Virginia. He labeled every timber with a painted number before it left its mortise pocket and stacked it on the ground in order, and Petra photographed every stage from the first pry bar in the siding to the last timber laid down. Pete told Dale at the end of the second week that in 11 years he had not deconstructed a barn with timber this old and this dense. He cut a cross-section from the main white oak corner post after it was on the ground and counted rings under a hand lens while Dale stood nearby. 96 rings. The tree had been growing when Washington was president. Pete set the cross-section aside to go with the documentation package. The barn was down by mid-August. The timber filled 2 flatbed loads and most of a third. The studio's check arrived in late September of 2014. The check was for $43,600. Petra set it on the kitchen table without saying anything. Dale picked it up and looked at it and set it back down. He did not say anything either. The foreman had measured the total timber at 3,040 board feet before the cut, and the studio had paid an average of $14.30 per board foot across the full load, weighted toward the chestnut and the oldest white oak in the corner posts and the main purlin timbers, with the cross-section from the corner post going into the provenance documentation for the first pieces the studio built. Roland Fitch's 0 and the studio's $14.30 were not measuring the same thing. One described what a county property appraisal system had been designed to see. The other described what the barn had actually been, $43,600. It landed the way a single number lands when it carries the weight of every prior assessment stacked against it. The bank had written liability. The county tax form had written storage area. Roland Fitch had written 0. And here was what the barn had actually been worth to a buyer who understood the material at a moment when the market for exactly this kind of material had climbed high enough to meet the quality of what had been patiently preserved. The number did not indict Roland Fitch. It indicted the measuring tool, which had no column for old-growth chestnut in a hand-hewn barn, and no column for 30 years of patient stacking, and no column for the provenance that a documented origin creates in a market that has learned to value it. The studio sent photographs of the first finished pieces in October of 2014. A dining table built from two of the Voss barn chestnut beams, hand-planed to show the adze marks, finished in a hard wax oil that let the grain and the oxidized surface read through the top coat. The patina showed as warm amber-brown darkening toward chocolate in the deepest figure. The studio's provenance documentation named the material as Salvage American Chestnut from the Voss Dairy Barn, Wythe County, Virginia, constructed 1887 by Ivor Voss, deconstructed June through August 2014 by hand deconstruction. The buyers were a couple in Charlottesville who had paid $11,000 for the table and had asked specifically, before they agreed to the price, where every plank of it had grown and stood and been cut. The origin was part of what the $11,000 covered. Marcus Webb came through the studio's network in 2021. He ran a sourcing operation in Brooklyn, connecting American craftspeople and small furniture studios to residential and boutique hospitality clients, and he had seen the Charlottesville studio's work at a trade fair in Atlanta and tracked down where the material came from. He had a client who wanted a full dining set, a table, and 8 chairs from a documented old-growth American source. The studio sent him to Petra. Petra had been running Voss Timber as a full-time operation since 2016. She had inventoried every board foot remaining on the property, photographing every timber, grading by species and structural condition and surface quality, and pricing each item based on the transaction record that had accumulated since 2010. When Marcus called, she sent him the inventory. He called back in less than an hour. The granary shed on the back of the property, she told him, had been built in the 1920s from timber salvaged from a still earlier structure, which put the oldest material in a growth ring range of 40 to 60 per inch. There was black walnut in the corn crib framing that had been living wood when Thomas Jefferson was at Monticello. There were poplar plates and joists from the collapsed milk house, air-drying under the tin roof since 1997, when the milk house surrendered to the weight of 2 bad winters in a row. And there were 200 board feet of original chestnut fence posts, the ones Pete Hayward had estimated at 80 years old when Dale pulled them, which placed them now approaching a century of age. Marcus drove down from Brooklyn in October of 2022 and walked the woodyard with Petra for 2 hours. He asked the questions that told her what kind of buyer he was, questions not about price, but about source and age and history, about what the original fence line had demarcated, about how long the poplar had been under the tin, about why the walnut from the corn crib was darker on 2 faces than on the others. He held one of the chestnut fence posts in both hands and turned it slowly, in the morning light, first one direction and then the other. He said it was the driest wood he had ever held in his hands. He said it as a material fact, the way a man reports a measurement. Petra watched him and said nothing. He made an offer before he left the property that afternoon. Granary shed deconstructed by hand, beams kept long, mortise pockets preserved, hewn faces intact where they existed. All 200 board feet of the chestnut fence posts, the walnut from the corn crib framing, the best of the dried poplar plates and joists, complete provenance documentation for every piece, including the photographic record from the original barn deconstruction forward, and a written history of the property and its structures going back to Ivor's arrival in Wythe County. 2,800 board feet of total volume, $41,000, cashier's check, payable at pickup. He drove back in February of 2023, arriving well before dawn, as has been told, and when the sun came up over the ridge and the amber light fell full across the stacked timber, he said he wished he had come sooner. Petra asked him why. He said because clients of his had been asking specifically for this kind of material, documented old growth from verified structures, for 3 years, and he had not known it existed here. He said the demand for authenticated salvage was outrunning supply by a margin the trade had not predicted 5 years ago, and the gap was widening. He said the price conversations now happening in his circles were not happening at $14 per board foot. They were happening in the mid-30s, and he expected them to keep moving. Petra said, in the level voice she used when she wanted a number to land without drama, that the property still held a spring house built in the 1890s and a bank barn whose sill timbers were intact and had not been inventoried. She said she would be in touch. Roland Fitch retired from the County Extension Office in 2018 after 30 years of rural property assessment in Wythe County. He had done the work honestly. He applied the standards of his training consistently and without malice across thousands of assessments, and the people who worked with him said he was fair and thorough and returned calls promptly. He was not wrong in the sense of careless or dishonest. He was carrying a measuring instrument that had been built to measure one kind of value in a decade before a market had formed that could price another kind of value, and the gap between his zero in the spring of 2009 and the studio's $43,600 in the fall of 2014 was not the measure of his failure. It was the measure of the distance between a system that sees what it has been trained to see and a reality that accumulates without asking permission from any system. Gary Prater finished paying off the sawmill note in 2016. By 2021, his soil organic matter had climbed from 1.1% to 2.8%, and his yield numbers in the dry years were no longer the same conversation as the county average. He expected to reach 3.5% organic matter by 2025 or 2026 if the cover crop seasons held. He was not going to match Dale's 4.2 for a long time. He had stopped trying to hurry it. He had learned at a cost he had not chosen, and that took him years to fully account for. That the ground does not respond to urgency, and that the things worth having in the soil are not built on a timeline a lender is prepared to recognize. Petra took Voss Timber past $250,000 in cumulative sales in 2022, selling documented old-growth salvage to furniture studios, architects, restoration builders, and individual craftspeople across 8 states. She had turned down 2 approaches from private investors who wanted an equity position in the inventory. The money she did not need for operations she put back into the property, into the soil program, into the cover crop seed budget, into the land her father had been patiently building for 30 years before anyone around him had a form that could measure what he was building. Dale was 67 years old in 2023. He still stacked wood. He moved more slowly than he had in 2009 and rested more often between loads, but the practice had become so much a part of the man that separating it from him was not a question that made sense. His granddaughter, Marin, Petra's daughter, was 4 years old, and she sat on the poplar stacks on Saturday mornings and watched him work with the particular gravity that small children bring to things they do not yet understand, but sense are serious. She would understand it eventually. He was in no hurry to explain it. The wood had waited this long. There are 2 ways of knowing a piece of ground, and they have been in quiet conflict at every rural property appraisal and every bank desk and every sale barn in America, for as long as both ways of knowing have existed. One is wide, portable, and confident. It travels well. It can be written into a manual and applied across 1,000 properties by a trained assessor who never stays through a single winter on the land he is assessing and never returns to see whether the prediction held. It is not wrong. It is built to measure what can be measured quickly and consistently from the outside, and it does that work well, and the world needs it for the things it can see. It is only incomplete in a way that the form does not reveal, a way that becomes visible only when something happens that the measurement could not have anticipated. When the drought settles in, or the market turns, or a buyer drives through the night from a different world for something the column had marked worthless. The other kind of knowing is narrow, patient, and tied to one specific piece of ground. It accumulates over years in the hands that handle the same wood, in the same seasons, and in the eyes that watch the same fields go dry and come back, and in the memory that holds what this particular soil has done in the wet years, and what it has refused to do in the dry years, and what the timber holds that no amount of fast growth can replicate. It cannot be written fully into a column. What can be written, what Petra put into the provenance letter for Marcus Webb, and for every buyer before him, is the part that traces back to a specific farm and a specific span of time, and the particular unbroken attention of one man who understood what he had before anyone around him believed it was worth understanding. Dale set a chestnut fence post across his knees in the cool light of a November morning in 2023 and showed Marin the end grain, holding it up the way his father had held a similar piece for him when he was not much older than she was now. He told her that a tree grew one ring every year, and that this particular tree had grown in a very particular place for a very long time, and that was why the rings were so close together that her eyes had to work to separate one from the next. She looked at the end grain for a while with the focused attention that children give to things that interest them. She asked if the tree was still there. He said no. He said what was left of it was here. She thought about that for a moment in the unhurried way that children think about large things when no one has told them yet to put the thought down and move on. Then she said she wanted to count the rings. They counted together in the morning light, her small finger moving carefully from ring to ring across the end grain, and his following a line behind to confirm what she found and to catch the places where two rings ran so close they looked like one. The wood held its measure quietly, the way it had always held it, carrying what it was made of forward from the day the tree first put down a root in that particular hillside in that particular county, and began, one ring at a time, to build something dense enough to outlast every assessment. What endures is not always what the measuring tool says should endure, and the kind of knowing that knows a place as it actually is, not as the model says it should be, not as the form permits, but as it truly is in its grain and its depth and the slow accumulation of what patient attention produces. That kind of knowing does not expire when the assessor drives away. It only waits for someone willing to count. Marin lost her place at 47 and had to start again. Dale waited. The wood waited with them both, the rings holding their record of every dry summer and every wet one. Every year the tree had grown fast, and every year it had grown slow, the whole compressed history of a particular place written in the width of the grain, patient and exact, the way the best kind of knowing always is.